we have a big Megadeth contingent in our audience.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's film discussion. Thank you for joining us at Bryn Mawr Film Institute's Film Studies Online. We are very eager to discuss this week's movie, Dr. Strangelove, which was suggested and will be discussed with us in part by my colleague, Jacob Mazer. Jacob, how are you? You doing well?
I'm well, thank
you. Good. Good. For those of you who might need a reminder, let's just go over the preferred procedure, please. Please keep your audio on mute until I call on you with your question or comment. I will know that you have a question or comment to make because you can use the raise hand function within Zoom, indicated by the number 2 right there. I will call on people in the order that they appear to raise their hand on my screen, and I will try to get to everybody at least once. I don't always have time to come back to people for a second or third comment, but I'll try to get through everybody at once. I'd also encourage everyone to please add comments in the chat window, introduce yourselves to the group in the chat window, let us know where you're from if you're from outside the greater Philadelphia area. And if you're from somewhere really far away from the greater Philadelphia area, please consider visiting the Where in the World page within Film Studies Online at our website, brynmawrfilm.org, to let us know where you're joining us from and how you found us and how you think we're doing based on whatever programs of ours you have attended. And that's pretty much how things are going to work tonight. So with that being said, you can see we already have some hands up, and oh my goodness, somebody beat out David Glusman to be number 1, and that is Gene Barretta. Gene, do you have a question or comment for us?
I have a comment. You guys are probably aware of this, but this is watching it this time around is the first time I noticed that in one of the final scenes when Dr. Strangelove's arm is going crazy and trying to kill him, and there's a shot where the Russian ambassador is standing behind him with the others, and as Peter Sellers is punching his own arm, you can see the Russian ambassador trying to squelch his laughter. He's really trying to hold it in, I guess, figuring that Kubrick was about to yell cut or something. Have you noticed that?
I did not notice that this time. Jacob, yeah. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, that's well observed, Gene. When you read accounts of the filming of the movie and of that scene in particular, it's noted that they really, in the editing process, they really had to chop this scene because apparently the crew was just, the crew and the extras and the other actors could just barely hold it back. So Sellers was so funny. It's good spotting. I guess they didn't cut out the Russian diplomat on the verge of laughter, but
yeah, look for it, Andrew. Look for it next time. It's there.
I will. Thank you. I mean, it could plausibly be within character, right? It could be that he found that guy's.
I don't think so.
No. I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to suggest that it's on purpose. I don't. Okay. I didn't mean that. I just meant that it's not the most egregious mistake to leave in,
right?
Because that whole thing is kind of ridiculous, and the idea that he would find the behavior of the American government inside its war room worthy of ridicule doesn't seem that far-fetched, but I was not suggesting it was on purpose. I completely agree with you that with your assessment, and I will look for it next time. Thank you for that. Did you have another comment or question?
No, that was it.
All right. Thanks for pointing that out to everyone, Gene. Take care.
Sure. Yeah, you too.
David.
Good evening. So tonight I'm calling in from Brooklyn. I realize that's not that far, but it's not my normal Ardmore either.
Well, that explains why you weren't first on the draw.
I think that somehow the system malfunctioned, or I was just slow in the update. My apologies.
No problem.
Anyway, so looking at this cast, it's pretty amazing to see all these people together. And of course, Peter Sellers as, I think I lost count, 5 or 6 characters. I think I mentioned several weeks ago that I had taken a film course in college, at which point I didn't know what I didn't know. And this, I believe, may have been one of the films that we saw in 1960, I guess it was probably 8 or 69. And one of the things I wanted to get the two of you into a little discussion, and we've talked about it before, is the differences in the so-called special effects and the way they're filmed and the way the audience views them. I don't remember laughing at some of the special effects when I saw them 50 years ago, but they were almost comedic until I put myself back into that time frame. And of course, you have the plane and the mountains and all of those, and then that final scene or near final scene of Slim Pickens riding the bomb all the way down to Earth. So if you want to talk about that for a little bit, I'd appreciate it. And again, thanks for bringing another film back into my brain.
Well, thanks for that, David. Yeah, my short answer is that I think your assessment, your read on it is right, that people were not looking at those special effects as wholly inadequate or completely ridiculous or what have you for the time. If that were true, I don't think the movies would have survived and thrived as a going concern in the way that they did for decades and decades before we reached the photoreal visual effects that we've had in the last couple of decades. So that's my short take on it. Jacob, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for your comment, David. It's funny, some of the effects, especially around the B-29 plane, show their age a little bit. For me personally, when I watch the film, sometimes when I watch old movies, I get taken out of it a little bit when seeing outdated effects or things that don't look modern. In Dr. Strangelove, watching this, so I always get drawn into the story. Yes, B-52 is the right plane. My apologies. Yeah, I always get so sucked into the story, and so I don't know. Like I said in my intro, although I think it's an extremely funny movie, I also find it fairly gripping. So I don't. I'm usually too drawn in when I watch it to be bothered too much by some rusty special effects. One thing that I did want to mention is that although there are some breaks in the realism of the film because of the limitations of the special effects, there's also an intense level of realism where Kubrick was able to achieve it. The cockpit of the B-29, I'm sorry, the B-52, I'm getting my models mixed up here. This film was done without any assistance or any consultation from the US military. And I think Kubrick found a photo shoot of a B-52 cockpit in a magazine and studied it scrupulously in order to sort of reverse engineer what the cockpit of that vehicle looked like. And supposedly it was accurate enough that when the film was starting to be seen, people wondered if they had received consultation. People in the American military wondered if there had been consultation off the books to Kubrick because it was accurate enough. So there is this level of realism, to it as well. It's not special effects, but it's in the preparation of the mise en scène and so forth.
But did you ever find out whether or not there was off-the-record military consultation? I don't remember seeing that in any of the.
There was not. No. Kubrick in some of his subsequent films would have, notably in like 2001, he had consultation from NASA. Not the situation in Dr. Strangelove. His co-writer, one of his co-writers, Peter George, who wrote the novel that it was based on, had been a lieutenant in the Royal Air Force in Britain, and he had some firsthand experience in in the sort of airborne element of the nuclear strategic plan for that country. So there was some, insider knowledge, but the American military nor any other military did not provide any consultation. Yeah. Kubrick, is sort of famously an obsessive, detail-oriented director, and he really brought that to bear in putting together the look of the film, the representation of the equipment and the protocols and everything like that.
The problem is if you want military cooperation, you have to at least be moderately concerned with how the military is going to come across in your movie. You have to share their concern with that element of it. And it's interesting because Jacob very, correctly talks about the stickler that Kubrick was, but to be a stickler on the micro level of having the military details right would mean that he could not be a stickler to things on the macro level, like character and story and satire and political message. And so that doesn't surprise me at all that he wouldn't have done that. In addition, he made his films in England, and I think that probably added another layer of difficulty to having American military cooperation. Though if it had been, Michael Bay making Pearl Harbor in England, I'm sure they would have cooperated. But this is an entirely different kettle of fish. Going back to David's original question, I think, movies are a form of media. That means they don't directly present society, they represent society. And we all have, none of us is unable to enjoy a stage play when we could go see them, because the set doesn't look exactly like the place it's supposed to be representing. And it's over the last few decades, between computer technology, between the ubiquity of cameras in the whole world, and in our lives, and the fact that so much more now is documented and done on video, that we've come to expect things on a screen to resemble precisely what we see with our eyes. And that obviously wasn't the case. The movies represented a huge leap forward when they began in terms of presenting the world on screens, but they were obviously very far from that, and people were very tolerant of that remaining distance. But we've all sort of gotten spoiled, for lack of a better term, for those reasons I just mentioned. So it's one of those things that you sort of can't, it's hard to put yourself back in that frame of mind, but sometimes if you can, it's worth it. Matt, you have a question or comment?
Yes, a couple of comments. One is, if I may, draw a parallel to our conversation last week, or at least draw a reference to the Parallax View, was a movie about a large mysterious corporation that was involved in some sort of political conspiracy. And here again in Dr. Strangelove, we have a movie about a very large organization, that being the Air Force or the Defense Department more generally. And instead of it being nefarious conspiracy, the way it's portrayed in this movie is more of a failure on the part of the organization to communicate, as the saying goes, communicate, command and control its component parts. And it comes across as this inept, mismanaged organization run by a bunch of buffoons. And I'm sure the truth is somewhere in between. The other point I wanted to make is to pay homage to Alec Guinness, who is just, I realized in watching this movie what a complete actor he is. And
You mean Peter Sellers?
I'm sorry, Peter Sellers. Why did I say Alec Guinness? But,
because they were peers, and there are films where Guinness plays multiple roles.
But Peter Sellers was just a complete actor in this movie. And, he has so many other movies where he's comedic, and The Pink Panther, but more serious in other movies. And here, of course, he plays multiple roles, and some of them are completely farcical, Dr. Strangelove. Some are more serious, but also kind of inept in The British Officer. And then as the president, he kind of combines them all into one, where initially in the meeting in the war room with all the generals around and George C. Scott, he's very serious and stern with George C. Scott. So you get the serious side of his acting, but then when he gets on the phone with the prime minister of the Soviet Union, it's all, again, almost farcical. It is farcical, the way he talks to his counterpart as if they were in-laws or, lost cousins or something. So again, the point just being that he is just a complete actor of all kinds, dramatic, comic, and everything in between in this movie. It was just a fantastic performance.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. And I appreciated your connection to last week's film, another movie about conspiracy, although I find this week's film, if we were looking at the incidents depicted rather than the tone of the film, I feel like I find this in a way at least as terrifying, because it shows one rogue person who can perpetrate, or start a chain of events that leads to tremendous death and devastation, and just because of his own individual, what I would say is a warped perspective. And that is, in some ways, that coupled with the incompetence that you mentioned, as well as the sort of, mercenary or kind of more selfish aspects depicted in some of those who are trying to stop him, to me, that's in some ways not more sinister, but a bigger threat. But that's neither here nor there. I think the other interesting thing to think about are connections between this movie and Paths of Glory, which we saw, and other Kubrick films like Full Metal Jacket. I think when there are things about the movies that mark them as different, clearly, but also some threads that run through them as well. Jacob, your thoughts in response to Matt's comments?
It's well observed. I think both of you are on point. Right. So, right. In contrast to the sort of, perspective of the Parallax View or other kind of 1970s political conspiracy films, the sort of fantasy of the conspiracy theory is that there's an all-powerful force behind everything that, society. And as you've identified, right, in Dr. Strangelove, it's almost inverted, the people with all the power, literally the fate of the world in their hands, can't, are inept or incompetent. And it's not just inept or incompetent. There's, they're driven by very base, kind of crude human instincts, by ego, by sort of one-upsmanship and machismo. There's a strong theme about sexual anxiety and the anxiety around sexual potency that runs through the film, and that seems to be part of what's motivating these characters. And and prodding them in their decision-making process. And so, I mean, I think this is kind of what's at the core of Kubrick's, vision, like one of the essential paradoxes about the situation that he's trying to sort of bring out, which is that despite having manifested this vastly dangerous technology, human beings are still human beings, and they still have all the stupid parts or the crude and absurd, parts of human nature too. And the fact that they are, sitting with their finger on the big button doesn't change any of that.
Yeah, and I think you see the sort of, the problematic relationship between humans, between man and technology. You see it less explicit, but still an element of a movie like Paths of Glory, and even in a more abstract way, a movie like Full Metal Jacket, I think. Let's see. Joss, do you have a question or comment?
Well, can
I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead, Jacob. Yes. I think
Are you a little bit? I'm losing you for.
Yeah. I haven't been hearing you, and if you're saying anything, Jacob. So why don't we see what Joss has to say? Joss, are you there?
I am here.
Go ahead, please.
Hi. So I was a kid in the 50s and early 60s. I saw this film when it first came out when I was 13 years old, and was just becoming aware really of what was going on in the world, and scared the hell out of me. In subsequent viewings over the years, I recognized the comedy. I want to go back to something that David said about the special effects, and in particular the airplane. There were several stock footage shots of actual B-52s in flight. And then there were that whole series of shots that David mentioned of these cheesy special effect obvious model airplanes flying over the same mountains over and over again. And I took that as one of the comic elements of the film. And I think in some ways that set up the final airborne comic shot of Slim Pickens, which was of the same cheesy quality, but absolutely chilling in its effect. And I think he was setting us up for that. I just wonder if anybody had any thoughts about that. I also wanted to echo Matt, who is my brother, if you haven't figured it out by now. The performances. Sellers was amazing in those three amazing characters. The sort of caricature of the British officer, the over-the-top Dr. Strangeloves, and the inept president. But there were some other performances that were also really key to this whole film. Sterling Hayden's obvious lunatic conspiracy theorist, and that kind of faded for a few decades, and boy, did it ever come back in our current time. George C. Scott's incredible clowning performance. And think about that in contrast to his performance just a few years later in Patton, which, could be a riff on the same thing. And then it's been mentioned Slim Pickens, who played it completely straight, which, also added to the comedy and to the frightening aspect of it. mean, I have a lot to say about this. I'm not going to go through all of it. One other thing was the use of, well, the cinematography was another element that really struck me. There was all this bright light, high contrast cinematography that was just not at all real, except for some of the scenes in the cockpit and the newsreel-like footage of the assault on the Air Force Base. And I don't know if those were just budgetary things or choices on Kubrick's part, may have been some of each. But the contrast in those visual styles was really striking. I could go on with all kinds of other stuff. I think this is one of the great films of all time, and there's so much to discuss, but I'll leave it for other people to get into it. And thanks for choosing this film. It's one of the greats.
Well, thanks for that, Joss. Thanks for your thoughts. I will just say that I think it is very interesting and very generous of you as a viewer to give Kubrick credit for sort of lining up the use of the sort of the model plane with the, the rear projection, with the sort of foresight of how he would have to, the only way he could probably do this Slim Pickens riding the bomb. It's possible. It is possible. Filmmakers do things like that. George Clooney shot Good Night and Good Luck in black and white because he realized it would look really silly to have what was supposed to be contemporary footage of Joseph McCarthy being all black and white while everything else was in color. So filmmakers do think about those things. I don't really think that was the case here, but it is possible. And I think that your eye noticing the difference in the way certain scenes were shot in the film is a combination of two things. One being the sort of different shooting conditions of being on a set in a studio that is depicting an office or something versus outside doing exterior filming as they would have for the fight scenes. That's certainly part of it, but also part of it, I think, is the desired effect to achieve different aesthetics for the suggestion about tone they make, which is what you were saying as well. So I think there's, multiple things can be true, and I think that's a case where that is the case. Jacob, your thoughts on what Joss was just saying? Jacob, there you go.
Hey, here I am, guys. And sorry that I cut out for a second. I was having some connection issues. I think it's more stable now. Anyway, Joss, you touched on a number of interesting things. I'm going to focus just on the performances, and I'll share some information that I was interested to discover. So Sellers plays 3 parts in this film. He was originally to play 4. The Slim Pickens part was actually initially going to be played by Peter Sellers. Sellers twisted his ankle or something like that while he was on the set, and the insurers of the film made a stink. And so Kubrick had to recast the part with Slim Pickens. A good choice, I think. This is at least the official story, although there are some accounts that say that Peter Sellers was having a very difficult time getting down the Texas accent, and that so the fact that there was a convenient injury that got him off the hook to doing that may have played a role too. Now, you also noted George C. Scott's performance, which is terrific. It's one of the hammiest or zaniest performances in the film, I think. And it's kind of interesting because Scott had intended to take a more restrained approach. He didn't want to play the character as broadly as what wound up in the film. And the way that Kubrick sort of finessed him into it is he would say, he would basically say, okay, George, let's just do like a warm-up take and like do it like as off the wall as you can, make it really loose and just, make it as crazy as you can. And we won't use that take, and then we can shoot, these more serious, or more toned down takes. And then of course Kubrick used like the most bananas takes. Now, I just wanted to mention one other actor of note who's in the film who you didn't mention. He's a small part, but that's James Earl Jones. Did you guys notice him in the Bomber? He was fairly young at that point, but it's a treat to see him in there too. And I think even with his small part, he's a striking screen presence.
Yeah, and even at that, it was interesting to see that even at that young age, he still had that voice.
Yeah.
Which I was curious about, and it was definitely still had its presence. Richard, do you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I mean, I saw the movie a long time ago, and I thought a lot of the stuff was just totally made up off the wall. That, the hand thing, and I found out that's a known medical condition. Likewise, I figured it was ridiculous that they didn't have a fail-safe on that. But as I check into it, apparently there was a possibility that somebody rogue could have set off the bomb. And I wonder if Kubrick knew this.
I don't know. I don't know what he actually knew, and I also don't know what was in the source novel. Jacob, do you have any information on that?
Yeah, I can speak to that. And I want to come back to Strangelove's hand in just a moment, too, which is a real medical condition, although I think Kubrick is doing some sly stuff with that. Let's put a pin on that for a moment. Right. One of the criticisms of the film, particularly from people in the military community when it came out, was that this idea of the basic premise of the film, a rogue commander setting off unilaterally ordering a first strike, was preposterous. And indeed, the film begins with a disclaimer of sorts that I think was put in there to appease the studio. However, although Kubrick didn't know it, and this I believe will a provision in the single integrational plan.
Jacob, we're Jacob, we lost you again.
And the
Jacob,
major command branch be eliminated or be.
Jacob, why don't you?
Hey, can you hear me now?
No, why don't you try turning off your picture, and maybe your sound will come through better. Turn off video. Yeah, we're really not getting you, Jacob, and I don't know if you can hear me tell you that or not, but
Hey, Andrew, can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay, better. My apologies, folks. I'm moving to another another space in the house, and hopefully the connection will be a little bit better. I don't know where I cut out, but
Go start over again about the failsafe,
Right.
lack of failsafe.
So this would not have been known to Kubrick at the time, but it has been revealed subsequently in materials and plans that have been declassified since then, that there were provisions in place in the American, what was called the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operational Plan, which was basically the American nuclear strategy, that should certain conditions happen that made the president and the highest in command in the civilian government unable to give the order, then the military could undertake it. And so the scenario that is described in Dr. Strangelove did have at least grounding, although it wasn't known to the filmmakers at the time. The other thing that I'll mention, kind of on the same topic, is that another thing in the film that was sort of was criticized as a preposterous touch by some critics of it at the time of its release, was this idea of a doomsday machine. However, in the 1980s, the Soviet Union implemented a system called Perimeter, which was basically a missile defense system with a function called Dead Hand, which basically laid out certain provisions where if the Soviet Union was struck, then there were sort of automated processes that would have triggered a reprisal. So there was a sort of doomsday machine analog that was developed subsequently to the film. And just like in the film Dr. Strangelove, the Soviet Union didn't make it public, which, as Dr. Strangelove notes, defeats the entire purpose of a doomsday machine and its deterrent effect. So there's a little background history.
Thanks for that, Jacob. That's very interesting. Let's see. Susan, you have a question or comment? Susan,
can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
It's actually my husband, Andy.
Well,
Okay,
I'm speaking.
go ahead.
I'm the boy named Sue. I grew up, I was in my 30s during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was convinced at that time that we were in for a nuclear war. And then 2 years later, this movie came out, and then the other movie, Failsafe, came out right behind it. And so, all this the stuff that we were hearing about the missile crisis, and then these two movies all started to fit together like we could be in very big trouble if we didn't have real control of our whole nuclear arsenal. And it looked like there was a lot of questions about whether we did or not. So this, these two movies kind of brought home all the feelings I had at the time that I actually saw them for the first time. And it became kind of scary. It's like having flashbacks of what could have happened during that 1960 time period. It seemed like we were very close to a real nuclear war with the Soviets.
Yeah, no, I don't doubt that. And it makes the bold decision to treat it with satirical gloves, to my mind, all the more bolder. And again, like I was saying last week about Parallax View, if you think about what the movie is, it's remarkable that a studio put it out. I would say the same thing for this movie as well, released 10 years earlier. Jacob, did you have any thoughts in response to Andy's comments?
Yeah, I'll just add this, which is you've remarked on the ways that Dr. Strangelove sort of picked up on the contemporary events and recent events rather, and sort of discourse and conversation about the role of nuclear weapons in society. And what's kind of interesting is that Dr. Strangelove then went on to become sort of part of that dialogue. Certainly that's become the case, over time, but this film came out in 1964, just before the presidential election, which had Lyndon Johnson running against Barry Goldwater, who was very hawkish, and Goldwater was, and had sort of argued that, perhaps using nuclear weapons to stop the spread of communism was an appropriate measure. Critics of Goldwater attacked him for this and compared him to Dr. Strangelove. and this came from both other people in the media, I'm sorry, other people in politics and from the media. There was a cover of Time magazine that had a picture of Barry Goldwater with Dr. Strangelove underneath it. So Strangelove, sort of wove its way into that conversation and into that moment.
Right, and that the election you're referencing, of course, gave us the famous Daisy ad, which even when I was in college decades later was still being shown in mass media classes. So that certainly had its impact, because this was something, as evidenced by a number of the comments tonight, that was understandably on the forefront of a lot of people's minds. Lilyan, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I find it very interesting. I think I saw this correctly, that the Peter Sellers character, the British officer, really is the one who finds the answer to the problem? Isn't he the one who realizes there's a code and goes through all these machinations to find it?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's the one. I mean, he's the aide to the crazy general, and he's the one who knows. He's probably the only one who knows what has to happen to make that go away. I think that scene that he does with, I can't think of his name, with the machine gun, when they shoot out the Coke machine to get the change so they can call the president. I mean, it's a movie about such a kind of underlying horrible topic, but watching it again the other night, I mean, it was so funny. It was really, it was just a brilliantly acted, so funny movie.
Yeah, well, we're really glad you appreciated it, and you're absolutely right that Sellers' character, the British officer, realizes, given, I mean, it's funny, right, that Sterling Hayden would rather kill himself than reveal the return code or whatever it's called, but he can't help himself. He is so obsessed with his precious bodily fluids that it's an obsession of his that he doodles about it, and it dawns on the Sellers character that has to be some form of that has to be the code. And of course that's hilarious, but also an extremely human thing to do, and a blind spot, to me, a believable blind spot for someone who the Sterling Hayden character who thought of seemingly of everything else that could have stopped his plan. Jacob, did you have any thoughts?
I will only add that if there is anything positive about for the characters about the end of the film, it's that Mandrake will not, after all, have to answer to the Coca-Cola company.
Good point. Ken, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, just a comment or two. I saw a big difference between this and the parallax view, in that in the one we saw last week, there was this big foreboding company who you knew controlled things that was very efficient. Oh, sorry about that. The phone just went off. Here, this was a government that seemed to be very haphazard, where any general who got an idea in his head would take action and put anyone in danger. And in a sense, it reminded me a little more of the TV series MASH, where they had these characters who would come in and you never knew whether it was going to be someone who knew what they were doing or someone who came up with a crazy idea that would put everybody in danger. And I kind of like that aspect of it. The other funny thing, which we haven't mentioned, and it's obviously it's a pretty obvious one, was that the gunfight between I guess it was an Army base or Air Force base, where they were, we had the American military shooting against each other, and the prominent in the center was that sign that said, "Peace is our mission." It was maybe it was considered subtle back then, but it was pretty obvious now. But I thought it was, as I said, I thought it was a nice contrast from last week's. And I was torn between thinking it was funny and thinking it was scary.
Well, thanks, Ken. I think that was probably one of the desired impacts. And a number of people have talked about you have in Parallax View, you have a corporation which is in control, and it certainly shouldn't be in charge of the things it seems to be in charge of. And then here you have the government who, in Strangelove, you have a government who doesn't seem to have any handle on something they should definitely have a handle on. And of course, the common thread there is this sort of really cynical and in some ways sinister view of these institutions that, a few decades earlier were not reasonably, but were held in some reasonable, positive regard by much of society. And some people talk about post-World War II and the onset of postmodernism and this loss of faith in institutions, but clearly it marks a sort of sea change that people are not content to simply accept the version of organizations or institutions that those organizations put out of themselves. Jacob.
Thank you for your comment. I wanted to pick up on Pieces Our Profession. One of the things that I think Kubrick, as well as Peter George and Terry Southern, his co-writers, were really trying to satirize and to skewer is what they refer to as the bureaucratization of terror, which basically was this sort of the sort of cloaking of the actual facts of what nuclear warfare and nuclear strategy entailed in this sort of neutral, bland, official language. I saw somebody mention this in the chat too, but at a certain point you see somebody with a binder that reads world figures in megadeaths or whatever, megadeath being the unit used to record or project 1 million deaths. And the idea of developing this sort of advanced administrative managerial way of talking and thinking about something that is horrific beyond imagination was, I think, one of the really dark ironies that that Kubrick and his team were picking up on.
Yeah, and that is you've identified another thread that the two movies have in common, and in fact, frankly, something that at least Paths of Glory, but probably also Full Metal Jacket has in common as well, which is this notion that something like warfare can be sort of professionally controlled and managed the way that a corporation can, or in the case of Parallax, that something like, political chaos and assassination can be, managed in a similar way. So that's definitely something that's on the mind of the culture of that time. Ben, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I actually had a question and a comment. First, I just wanted to say that this movie is really interesting for a teenager to watch. I'm a teenager who's currently going through, U.S. history. And I'm currently learning about, the Cold War time. And this is a really interesting film to watch, just as kind of like, not a historical film, but as an interesting snapshot of that time. And as a comedy, it's very interesting to watch. Also through that like historical context as someone who wasn't there for it. So it's just a comment. I was also wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about the final scene. It's one of my favorite, the bit with the music and the montage of the Doomsday device going off. It's I think one of my favorite endings to a film ever. It really perfectly encapsulates, I feel like, the whole film as a whole. And I just wonder if you guys could talk a little bit about that. Like, one thing I was specifically curious about is where they got all that footage of the explosions and whatnot for the final montage.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Jacob, do you have any thoughts? I have some, but what do you have to say in response to Ben's comments and questions?
Certainly. Let me tell you about where the footage comes from before I speak to the content of the scene. Although there's only been 2 atomic or nuclear weapons used in a warfare context, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there have been hundreds and hundreds of nuclear weapons detonated by various nuclear powers around the world in the course of testing. And so the footage that you see at the end of the film comes from various shots from 5 or 6 of those various tests. One of them being the Trinity test in July 1945, when the first bomb was detonated. So yeah, let's talk about that amazing last scene. The song that plays during that section is "We'll Meet Again" by the British singer Vera Lynn. The song was, I believe, released in 1939, and it was known very widely in Britain, particularly as a World War II song. The sentiment being, people would, it was like encapsulating the sentiment of people leaving their loved ones to go fight in the war. And the feeling of it is, optimistic that, although we don't know what's going to happen, we will meet again. So deployed in this context, I think there's a couple different ways that you can interpret it. One is as pure irony, because this is a situation where you will probably not meet again. This is not the kind of war where most people come back from. But perhaps, on the other hand, another way to read it is also ironic, but I wonder if there's the sentiment that, before we get this montage of the explosions and the song, we hear enthusiasm from both the officials, the American officials in the war room, and the Russian ambassador there in this plan to descend into mine shafts and live down there for 90 years with 10 women to every 1 man. And I wonder if perhaps another layer of irony in the choice of using that song, "We'll Meet Again," is being that Kubrick is so interested in this sort of enduring qualities of human nature despite the technical sophistication. Is it the case that maybe 90 years from this point, humans will emerge from their mine shaft and then just develop this situation all over again? So those are a couple different ways that I think you could read it.
It's interesting. I never actually read it like that. The last way you said that's very interesting.
Thanks, Jacob. You think you covered those bases well. Let's see. Jerry, you have a question or comment?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I was going to say, I was a child of the 60s. I grew up in the duck and cover days. My father was the head of civil defense in my small town in Louisiana when people were building bomb shelters. But I never saw the movie until the mid-'80s. And it's my favorite movie. But what I take from the movie is that it's sort of prescience in realizing that history is not determined by grand plans, but by individual actions that are egregious or mundane. So Kubrick, in a way, predicted the end of the Soviet Union, not by nuclear lunacy, but the way it really happened was just by sort of bureaucratic bungling. And it wasn't a grand plan, it was the act. So in November of 1989, there was a Politburo member in East Germany who was sent out to talk to the international media about these new, a relaxation of travel restrictions in East Germany. And he hadn't read the new directives, and he came out and said, yeah, you can travel more easily now to the West. And some reporter from Italy said, well, when does that begin? And he said, tonight. he goes, well, I guess it's tonight. And then 2 hours later, people were crossing the Berlin Wall and it was all over with. And so that's actually what, and then by, that December, Romania had fallen. And then, shortly after, a year later, the Soviet Union was gone as well. So that's what I sort of take from this movie, is that there's no grand design on history. It's decided by individuals, whether it's, a homicidal maniac or just these bumbling bureaucrats.
Well, that's an interesting take on it. Something that jumped out at me. There's certainly a version of history that gives some credit for the end of the Soviet Union to Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, among others, for basically having military buildup that forced the Soviet Union to try to keep up with its expenditures and its technology, and it was unable to do that. And I found it interesting that the ambassador sort of complains to Peter Sellers, president, in this movie from 1964, before Ronald Reagan was even governor of California. And sort of it's an articulation of what Reagan would say was one of his strategies. Whether it was intentional or not, I don't know. But the idea that the ambassador says we can't keep up with your space race and your arms race and your washing machine race and your all those other things. So another thing that years before it would come to pass that the film mentions, again, I don't know how accurate any of that is from a historical perspective, but that jumped out at me this time as well. All right, thanks for that, Jere. Barbara, you have a question or comment?
Hi, Andrew. It's Richard.
Oh,
that's okay. We didn't change the name. Our apologies. I was wondering if you could comment on the names in the film, and also I mentioned earlier in the chat the near total absence, except for Bucky's girlfriend, as far as I recall, of any women in the film. Strange Love kind of invites some thought. Buck Turgidson and Bat Guano and even President Muffley with the sexual allusions there. It seems to me more than just Kubrick trying to be clever or slip things by to see if the audience picks them up. There seems to be some indictment of this kind of machismo male fascination with this kind of strange love that's expressed in this bizarre use of power and control, and it just seems like something we haven't touched on yet. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts.
I think you summed that line of thought up quite well, Richard. Jacob, do you have anything to add?
Certainly, yeah. I think that's really well observed. I alluded to this a little bit in my introduction, but one of the themes that comes through in Dr. Strangelove a lot is that the whole sort of thinking about the nuclear, the military handling of nuclear weapons is sort of underscored by this kind of machismo and this and the fact that they haven't had an opportunity or grounds to drop the bomb seems to create a great deal of basically sexual frustration for many of the sort of most hawkish characters in the film, and you've broken the names down, well, right? So, and there's this sort of contrast of the sort of most gung-ho characters, like Buck Turgidson, he's like a buck, and also turgid, we have that pun there, and so on and so forth, with whereas the characters who are more moderate or more restrained with it, like the president, get these sort of feminine coded names as if they're not adequately masculine. I wonder if this was in part a touch of Terry Southern, who was one of the writers on the film and was kind of part of this sort of early counterculture literary tradition too, and that sort of like satirical naming of characters is something that you see a lot in like in early counterculture literature from the 60s. Like if you've read Thomas Pynchon novels or whatever, it's like full of stuff like that. So
yeah, I mean the sort of the idea that the sort of hyper aggressive masculinity that some of these characters are exhibiting or are sort of eager to try and, you know, pull off, so to speak, that that's a mask for something else, or that is some sort of you know, through a prism view of something else, is a notion that has existed in film literary studies for a long time and would come back again in a big way in the 1980s, speaking of Reagan and the Cold War, with the action movies of that era, and a reading of some of them at any rate of having some homoerotic elements to them. So that here is clearly intentional, and I really think you put it out there very well, Richard.
And they're all pleased. They all sort of come around to the idea of nuclear annihilation if it means, you know, that they get to go down into the mine shafts and get to work reproducing the human race. You know, they all seem much more comfortable with the idea of nuclear apocalypse once Strangelove raises that idea too, which, you know, plays on that same topic.
Right.
Yeah.
Amy, you have a question or comment?
Yes, thank you. One question and just a comment. The question was the scene where the Russian ambassador at the end has what looks like maybe a time bomb. He's twisting. It looks like a clock, and I thought
it's a camera.
Oh, that was the camera?
Yeah, it was a hidden camera. He's taking pictures after he's accused of doing it in the beginning, when they're all too preoccupied with counting the multiples of women they will each have to themselves. He's over there taking pictures of the war room.
Okay. I just want to remind everybody also that in World War II, there were calculations made about how many men were going to die in Normandy. So that your comment about the megatons did seem kind of cold and chilling, but it was done before in previous times.
And that was one of the justifications for Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the number of people who would have been killed in having to invade the Japanese islands. So yes, it was definitely a consideration.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to stop you from talking. If you had other comments or questions, you're welcome to share them.
Well, the only other thing that I found striking, and then I'll end, was the doodle that he found in the desk, and how well drawn that doodle was. I just thought that was just fascinating. Of course, you only saw it for a brief snippet, but I just thought that was, was that his essence, and he was putting it down in writing?
Right. Right. I mean, it totally makes sense. On the one hand, we don't think of, the stern older, general of doodling, but on the other hand, he couldn't stop talking he couldn't keep spilling the beans about his essence. And so, of course, he would be even doodling about it because it was so always on the forefront of his mind, or on the front of his mind. Jacob, did you have anything to add?
I mean, just about the doodle. I mean, I think one of the the goofs of the film is that there's a juvenile quality. The characters, no matter how high-minded and august their position would seem to present them as, they're mostly preposterous characters who are, quite juvenile in many ways. I mean, I'm thinking this is not General Ripper, who doodles like a schoolboy as he's making calculations to begin a nuclear war. But I was thinking of Turgidson, like taking the call from his girlfriend while he's in the war room and like trying to sort of calm her down or get her off his case, or or the presidents bickering on the war line, the president and the premier, like a like a couple that's been married for for a long time, or or whatever, anybody who would bicker with each other. So
yeah, that's definitely there we've talked about the ways that these characters are sort of cut down to size or even below size, and that's certainly one of them as well. Robert, you have a question or comment? Robert Hirsh, did you have a question or comment? Okay.
Oh, can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, now we can. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So one of the characters Peter Sellers plays is the doctor with the German accent with the funny glasses, whose arm, mysteriously goes into the Sieg Heil mode. My question is he supposed to be parodying someone who was real, who was historical from history? Is there a Werner von Braun influence there? Am I opaque to this?
You're certainly right about the Werner von Braun influence, and of course a lot of people know that I think it was called Operation Paperclip, the OSS, which was the predecessor to the CIA. There was after World War II ended, there was a big fight over who was going to quote unquote win the peace, and Germans had really good missile and rocket scientists, and the Soviets wanted them and the Americans wanted them, and we got at least some of them, including Werner von Braun. So that's one influence. I think there were others though as well. Jacob, you might know something about that.
Yeah. There's a couple of others that went into that character. So Werner von Braun is, the major one. The other character who was not as much of a public figure, but was somebody who Kubrick knew and talked to as he was preparing for the film, was a strategist named Herman Kahn, who worked for the Rand Corporation, and which was, an influential military think tank. And note that Dr. Strangelove works for the Bland Corporation. So there you go. The affect was supposedly taken from the famous crime photographer named Ouija, who was a German immigrant and was somebody who Sellers, knew. Some people have thought that there was a little bit of a young Henry Kissinger in there as well. Kissinger began his or early in his career was a specialist in nuclear strategy. So those are some of the characters that went into Strangelove. I also, if I may, I wanted to talk about his hand a little bit, which is this hilarious aspect of the character, but is also, I think, revealing. That Strangelove's hand, as was referred to before, there are medical conditions where one's hand is known to act sort of independently of the body and of the will. But Strangelove's hand is like sort of a tell, I think. Like it sort of expresses the desires that are really kind of undergirding, the whole, the desires or the instincts that are really undergirding, this whole sort of nuclear strategy. I mean, we see the hand do basically three main things. It Sieg Heils, it tries to strangle himself, and although it, it's sort of off camera, the implication is that it's grabbing his crotch. And so, there's a sense that, some of, that there's a strain of maybe a totalitarian impulse, that there's a sort of self-destructive instinct, and also that there's a sort of sexual impetus that kind of runs underneath, all the high-minded nuclear strategizing, and Dr. Strangelove's hand sort of gives up the game on that.
Okay, I was thinking in terms of the Tom Lehrer song, Werner von Braun, and I think that may have had currency at the time.
Thanks, Robert. Jerry, you had a question or comment.
Yes. So during one of the moments where Dr. Strangelove was struggling with his hand, there's a famous scene, or infamous scene, I guess, where the Russian ambassador sort of breaks character and begins laughing in the background, and I guess Kubrick didn't catch it, and you can see it in the final cut of the movie where he begins to laugh.
It's so perfect that you mentioned that, because our first commenter started us off with that comment. So now you are going to wrap us up with that comment. So that was great.
The one one other thing, if I might, back to the ending. So is it true that Kubrick had considered a pie fight for the ending? And if so, what sort of thankfully got him going in the other direction of the mushroom cloud?
I know that was the intention. I'm not sure what steered him away from it. Jacob, do you have any thoughts on that?
I can speak to that. Not only was it the intention, they filmed it. And you can find photographs from it if you look around on the internet. And you can, if you watch the film, there's earlier, I think when the Russian ambassador or the diplomat is entering the war room, you see some pies on a cart. So, you see the setup for it. Right, the idea of the film, the original ending called for a massive pie fight to break out in the war room, I think partially motivated by conflict between the various branches of the military, and it ended, I think, with the president and the Russian ambassador completely covered in custard pie, playing patty cake. So they did film it, and a couple things affected, a couple things motivated Kubrick to change it. The first was, supposedly the first person to get hit by a pie is the president, and a character makes a comment. One of the other characters says something like, the president has been cut down in the prime of his youth. And shortly before, as they were preparing to release the film, or as they were in post-production, Kennedy was assassinated. And so that they were sort of anxious to avoid a reference to that. The bigger reason, though, seems to be that it just didn't work that well. Kubrick, they filmed it. I think they only had the budget to do it once, and it didn't fit. And so they came up with, another ending, with the montage of mushroom clouds and the song, which I am told was recommended to them by Spike Milligan, who was another famous British comedian who worked with Sellers.
The Kennedy angle makes sense in a way that, so in the scene where Slim Pickens is going through all the sort of survival kit they have, and the Ruski Bible and the hosiery or whatever, he says a fella could have a good weekend in Vegas with this, and originally that line was a good weekend in Dallas, but they went back and subbed that out, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, they looped it out.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you.
Donald, do you have a question or comment? Donald, are you there? Okay. There you are, Donald. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I wonder if Kubrick and his screenwriters used as a model for General Jack Ripper, General Curtis LeMay, who famously smoked cigars, orchestrated the war on Japan, World War II, was very aggressive with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and was famous in his campaign in '68 with Wallace for saying about North Vietnam, bomb them back to the Stone Age.
Yes.
Curtis LeMay, was he a model for Jack Ripper?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's not a coincidence that Ripper's an Air Force guy. And that's what, and he's basically in charge of the I don't know if they call it Strategic Air Command in the movie or not, but it's Strategic Air Command, which is what LeMay was in charge of. So absolutely. Jacob, did you have anything to add on that?
No, you hit it on the nose.
All right.
Good.
Well, thanks
Good
very
looking
much.
at them.
Thanks very much, Donald, and thanks everybody for joining us. We do this pretty much every Monday. We do other things as well online. We have our remote classroom on select Tuesday nights where we have seminars you can attend. We have the ones that are coming up, you can see on the screen there. Short Cinema, German director Fritz Lang's years in Hollywood. A seminar on Breaking Bad, and a talk I'll be giving about the Oscars, both the history of them as well as some of the changes for this unusual year. If you want to get a head start on what we're up to, you can sign up for our emails, learn about, every Thursday we send out an education email with a link to the instructor's introduction for the film to watch, and a link to register for the following Monday's discussion of that film. So please consider signing up for our emails at brynmarfilm.org and see what else we have going on in the Film Studies Online section, as well as at Theater 5, where we have movies that you can't see anywhere else except through our theater. Movies that, really interesting films from around the world across a variety of genres, selected by Jacob, who is our programmer and does a great job picking a wide range of films for everybody. So check that out in the Theater 5 section of our website. And as always, we, as many of you know, we are working toward reopening. We currently have the opportunity to rent the theater for your own family little bubble if you want to see the movie of your choice. But until we can reopen on our full terms, we could really benefit from some additional financial support. So if you have the means to do so and like what we're doing, please consider making a donation to Bryn Mawr Film Institute. But whether you're able to give or not, and whether you engage with any of our other programs or not, we hope to see you here this coming Monday for another film discussion and for many Mondays to come. So take care, everybody. Thanks for joining us.